right, well, welcome everyone tonight to our seventh session talking about how to read the Bible. And we're starting tonight by looking at the Psalms, and then in just a moment we're going to look at the wisdom literature. And that, of course, follows right along with what you've been reading. The Psalms section is a little bit shorter, so I'm just going to take just a little bit to kind of mention a few things about the Psalms and then spend most of our time talking about wisdom. If we go a little too long with this particular session, we have the opportunity to finish it with the Revelation next week. But the question that we ask every time we come to a different section is, why do we need to do it? Why do we need to interpret it? Why can't we just read Psalms? We like Psalms. They're in the Bible. We enjoy them. We memorize them. Why do we need to interpret them? And the answer is again and again, because they're so challenging. You know, this is true of all the different genres. There's parts of it that is very challenging, and then there's sections of it that are just plain misinterpreted. So, for example, in the Psalms, one of the challenges is that it's not written in a way that we're just can get a straight message. It's written in a poetic kind of form. The other thing that's interesting about the Psalms is that they're not written to us. They're actually written by someone else to God. And so we're listening into a conversation they're having with God. They also don't really teach us, quote unquote, good behavior. They relate to God through the heart. They relate to God through the mind. So these create some challenges for us. The most beloved psalm is probably Psalm 23. And it's a good example of how we misinterpret the Bible in a way. The author uses the analogy of the fact that the psalm, which speaks of the Lord as a shepherd, that's good, but it speaks of us as a sheep, which frankly is bad. It's not a flattering thing to refer to someone as a sheep. They're hard to herd, and there's lots of problems with being a sheep. And so this is one of the things that we forget as we read the Psalms and we read the Bible, as we become so familiar, is that we often miss what the original reader would have immediately been struck by. So these are just some of the kind of challenges that we deal with. The solution is, throughout all of this, is to go to that world, to use all of our tools to understand historical and literary context. And this is all called exegesis. Now, the first step in this process is always to identify what we call the genre, the style of writing, the kind of writing that it is. So what in the world is Psalms? Well, the clue is your graphic. It's music. It's musical poetry. It's musical poetry that's written with emotion, and emotion can be easily misread in the Psalms. We can add our own meaning to it or over-interpret it. We can also miss what is the most obvious thing about poetry. It's not always literal. It's often quite metaphorical. In Psalm 114, when it says the mountains leapt like rams, it's not like the mountains over there in Israel are more mobile than the ones over here. This is exaggerative, metaphorical language. But it matters in some cases because it's theology. The example the author uses is Psalm 51, verse 5, when David has his great confession, Bathsheba and murdering Uriah. He says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Blot out my iniquities, my transgressions that are always before you." And he gets all the way down to verse 5, and he says, "For surely I was sinful from my birth, from the time my mother conceived me." And theologians through the years have said, you see, we have a total depravity. We're sinful from birth. If that's the case, though, the problem is we can't let that scripture be the determiner of it. Because in Psalm 51, verse 5, when David says, "I was sinful from my birth," and then adds, "from the time my mother conceived me," he is using poetic language. He is describing how sinful he feels in this moment. He feels really bad, and he's describing it in that way. He's not necessarily telling us something theological, and if we're not careful, we can read into it something that is not actually trying to tell us one way or the other about. So how do we handle that? Well, the authors suggest we identify some features of the text. One is we need to know the type. And in a moment, I'm going to show you different types of psalms, laments and thanks and so on. The other is you want to see whatever structure might be there. You'll want to know what function, and I'll tell you about how some are royal psalms for kings and how we'll sometimes we take these and we use them at the wedding, and they're about royal coronations, and they're not necessarily about that setting, but we can apply them to the settings as we sometimes choose to, but that doesn't mean that's what they're trying to do. The pattern, and I'll show you a pattern tonight. In Psalm 119, the whole thing is one huge pattern. A modern translation will actually show you this. The whole thing is structured by the Hebrew alphabet. It's alphabetized. And then the unit. We want to read the unit and not just the verse. The authors use the example in Psalm 51, just going back to that same psalm. After David says that, he then says, God does not desire sacrifice. And you have to kind of scratch your head and go, well, then what about the New Testament? What about the cross? Surely that's not a truthful statement. So what is David getting at there? Well, if you go on reading to the end of Psalm 51 in verse 19, he talks about what you really desire, God, is a broken and a contrite heart. And so here what we're seeing is David is not saying God doesn't desire sacrifice. He's saying no amount of sacrifices is going to suffice if my heart is not right with you, God. And so this is a really different thing. We have to read the whole unit to really understand what is being talked about there. So that's an example of that. So let's see some of these things in terms of their function and type. I'll just tell you about the function and then I'll list the types for you. The function of the Psalms, really important to remember this, they're a hymn book. They are the hymn book of the Israelite people. They're worship. And they were with instruments. I know our Church of Christ friends may not have come upon that yet or not. I'm not sure. But the truth is they were obviously accompanied by instruments. In fact, some of them specifically tell us the instruments they were accompanied by. The other thing is the Psalms didn't just drop out of heaven. They are actually a collection. They're a collection of 5 books. If you read through the Psalms, you'll see this. There's 5 different books. They were all collected after the Babylonian exile. Babylonian exile started in 586, 70 years later or so, they come back. So late 500s, beginning 400 BC, they collect these things together. Inside of them, you see sometimes the functions because the Psalms have at the top of them a little note, and it's called a superscription. And it'll identify the function. Sometimes it'll say this is a Psalm of David, or a Psalm of a Hallelujah, or a Psalm of Moses, or a Psalm of Solomon, or of Asaph, or of Korah, which was a famous music school in Israel. They're used also by the early Christians in the New Testament. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. When you gather together, you should sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs and make melody in your heart with one another. That's how early Christians worshipped. So what did that look like for them, and what are these types that we would recognize today? One of them is lament. It's interesting, we don't do a lot of lamenting in the church in our worship, but they did. More than 60 of the Psalms are actually laments, and by the way, there's a whole book in the Bible called Lamentations. We know the Thanksgivings. We know the Thanksgiving Psalms from heart. We could quote lots of them. There's 6 groups of them plus 10 individual ones that are all built around being thankful. Psalms, obviously, of praise. Psalms that tell Israel's story of how God saved them, how he delivered them out of the experiences of Egypt. There are some of those. There are psalms that celebrate or affirm things like God's covenant with Israel, the kingship, the enthronement. It talks a lot about Zion, one of those hills that Jerusalem sits on. A lot of conversation about Jerusalem itself. And then psalms of wisdom. Now it's interesting that if you go to the book of Proverbs, there's actually in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 8, a psalm. So the Psalms have Proverbs, and the Proverbs have Psalms. So that's kind of interesting to think about. And then, of course, they are Psalms of trust. Something interesting to do sometime would be to sit down and read through all the Psalms, or just look through them real quickly and just say, I wonder which one this one is. I wonder if this is a psalm of lament or thanksgiving or praise. And you could actually pretty quickly categorize it. Might make it much more interesting for you to do so, because then you can be thinking about, this is what I'm supposed to do with this psalm. This is what this psalm is showing me how to use it for myself. Now there's another type that I didn't mention called imprecatory psalms. It comes from the word meaning to pray, that was used to invoke a curse on someone. So if you prayed for something bad to happen to someone. Now, I know none of you would ever do that, but that is a psalm. It's actually a very common psalm. Psalm 69, Psalm 109, Psalm 5, 6, 11, 12, 35, 37, 40, 52, 54, 56, right on up to 59, 79, 83, 94, 137, 139, 143. So a whole bunch of them are imprecatory. They're invoking God to do bad things to their enemies. But maybe the most poignant of these inspires this picture, which is 9/11. And I remember after 9/11, in seminary, pastor friends all saying they gathered in their congregations and they read the imprecatory Psalms because they were a way for people to say, how do I voice my outrage? How do I voice my frustration? Psalm 137 is an example of this. It says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. This is a picture of the exiles as they've been taken from their homeland and they're living in Babylon. There on the poplars we hung our harps. You can just see them doing that. For there our captors asked us for songs. Can you just picture the captors saying, sing us a song? Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And it goes on. Verse 8, daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you've done to us. Verse 9, happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. One of the darkest of all, the prayer that the Babylonian children would be the victims of infanticide. These raw emotions invoke in something some of us could feel had we lived through the exile and seen what they had done to the children of the Jewish people. So these come to our mind as very raw and very real, but they raise for us real questions, like when the Psalm says that they hate someone. How do we as Christians in the New Testament take Matthew 5:22 that says we don't hate anybody? And the answer the authors give is that hatred in the Psalms is not hatred as it is in the New Testament, but it has to do with another idea of rejecting. Regardless, the Psalms are a powerful way that shows us that God is not afraid of our honest frustration and our honest feelings. In fact, they model for us a good way in which we could convey that to him. So that's that world. The question then is always, how do we bring that into our world? And that's answered with hermeneutic. I just have a few things to say about it. One is, don't do, one of the things they say is don't do, like the TV preachers that will say, read this psalm and you too can be, healthy and wealthy and never have any problems in your life. That's not what the Psalms do. They're real emphatic. They don't guarantee the, quote, good life. But what they do is they speak to God, not to us, and they model for us how we might speak to God. They model worship. They're a worship guide. But they also model something else I think is really important, and that is honesty to God. And our honesty to God is a pathway to our closeness or intimacy with God. It's a reminder that God wants us to do that, and we should do that, and the Psalms beautifully show us how we can do that. But the other thing they do is they show us that we should and can reflect on and meditate on how God has acted in history, God's actions, who God is and what God does. And when we reflect on that, the biblical word for that is worship. It's worship. And so they're a beautiful model for us of how we can worship. So that's a little bit about the Psalms, as I could in just a few minutes summarize it for you. Let's turn our attention now to Proverbs and wisdom and think a little bit about that. I can remember hearing about wisdom all my life. I learned, from Ben Franklin, don't throw stones at your neighbor if your own windows are glass. Intelligence is the mother of good luck. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. These aphorisms have been around for a while. What is wisdom really? Well, as we look at wisdom in the Bible, we'll discover that it is often also misunderstood or misapplied, and if we don't do that right, we miss God's benefits for us. So let's take a moment and think about what is wisdom and what is a wisdom book. There are 3 books the authors say are actually wisdom books. Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. Some of the Psalms and some of the Song of Songs. Sometimes some of you might call it the Song of Solomon. What is this wisdom that's being conveyed? The authors define it as the ability to make godly choices. In Hebrew, the word is hakma, and it means the skill. You could have a skill for sailing. You could have a skill for carving and cutting wood or masonry work. But it came to refer to the skill for living life well and living the life God wanted you to live. I've often thought to myself, if I were not a Christian and I said, I want to be wise, where would I find wisdom? Would I find it in universities, bookstores, on television? If I turn on the TV today and watch The View, would I get wisdom, right? For life, godly choices. See, this is the problem. Where do we find true wisdom? And this is what the wisdom books do for us, is they provide that. But they provide it in ways that if we're not careful, we can misinterpret it. And these are the examples that they say we typically misinterpret it. First, we piecemeal it. We'll take a verse in the wisdom literature out of context. Example, preacher gets up to do a funeral, Ecclesiastes 3:2. It's a time to be born, and there's a time to die. And then the preacher says, you see, God takes care of us because all of this is in his hands. Well, that's true, but that's not what Ecclesiastes 3:2 is saying. What it's saying is life is transitory. Life is elusive. We're here today. We're gone tomorrow. That's what James says. Life's like a vapor. So the challenge is not reading the verse just by itself, but trying to capture the sense of the larger thought in the book. The example there is Ecclesiastes. The other is we don't pay attention to terms. Proverbs loves this term fool. And Proverbs 14:7 says, stay away from a foolish man. Some would-be parent says to their child, don't hang around those kids. They don't get good grades. Is that what it means to be a foolish person? No. The foolish person in the book of Proverbs is an infidel, a moral fool. It is a person that you do not look to for wise life. A fool is not the person you model your life after, and so you don't look to them for wisdom. So it's important to understand that in order to properly interpret that. The other way we don't do the wisdom right is we don't trace the line of thought. And the good one is Job. I know some of you are probably reading through Job right now in your Bible studies, but Job's message often gets lost because we know a Job verse here or there. Well, Job's wife said, Job's friends said, Job said. But we don't trace the line of thought through the whole entire thing. And if we're not careful, we can actually pull out a verse out of Job that completely contradicts the real message that the book is trying to convey. Why don't you just curse God and die? Okay, we should just do that. No, that's not the message, is it, in the book of Job? So understanding that is very important. Now, to do this, once again, just like in the poetry, we want to know the forms. In the wisdom literature, obviously, one form are Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is proverbial, and that's kind of defines itself. But some of the wisdom is speculative. This is the kind of wisdom that you have when you're sitting out and you're looking up at the stars and you're saying, I wonder this about God, or I wonder this about the world, or you're in some deep conversation, speculating on the nature of reality or whatever. This is what Ecclesiastes does. It asks the deep questions. This is what the book of Job does. It's highly speculative in nature. And then some is lyric, that is to say, it's a song. The Song of Songs is wisdom in song. Long before popular music or country music, there was this kind of music. And then poetry, right? Some of the proverbial stuff is poetic. And the thing I want you to keep remembering about poetry, I said this before, is that poetry in the Bible is always either synonymous, meaning that a verse starts and then restates the thing over again, like Proverbs 7:4. Say to wisdom, you're my sister. Say to wisdom, you're my relative. Synonymous. It's the same idea. Antithetical. Proverbs 10:1. A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother. See, they're antithetical. They contrast each other. They're contrasting thoughts, but they're making the same point, aren't they? Making the same point. And then synthetic, which is builds, Proverbs 21:16, whoever strays from the path of prudence comes to rest in the company of the dead. That's pretty blunt. That's a pretty blunt way to put it. There are other forms. You can read them in the book. There are acrostics, which are those, letters that spell out a word, but they are a way to remember it. The example is the Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 31 is actually an acrostic in Hebrew. There's alliteration. Ecclesiastes 3 is a time to be born, a time to die. It's alliteration, just like the preacher uses all the P's at the beginning, through his sermon. They do the same thing. See, that's where I'm getting this from. I'm getting it from Ecclesiastes. It's biblical. It's absolutely biblical. Numerical sequences also take place in Proverbs 30. Comparisons, parables, allegories, and riddles. So there's lots of this kind of stuff. So we want to pay attention to that. These are the common forms. Now let's just look specifically at these books and see if we can learn a little bit about them before we're done here. Let's start with Proverbs, okay? So if we're looking at Proverbs, we're looking at wisdom in Proverbs, what are we looking for? Well, we are noticing, first of all, that the proverb wisdom is practical, right? You read Ecclesiastes, you get a different feel. But you read Proverbs, and I mean, it is practical. Some people that are really practical, I love the book of Proverbs. I don't know anything about the rest of the Bible, but I love Proverbs because it's very practical in nature. It's practical for everyday life. It's also very memorable. If you want to start memorizing the Bible, start with Proverbs. You can memorize almost every one of them. They're just very memorable. They were written to be remembered. But they're not speculative. They don't answer the great questions of life. They don't even pose them. They teach basic values. They talk about things like parenting. How should you raise your child? Raise them up the way that they should go, so that later they're still going that way. That's essentially the nature of the Proverbs. Now, they also deal a lot with this thing called folly. The fool and folly and this sort of thing. There's a life of wisdom and a life of folly, and they're often painted in very diametric ideas. So what is the life of folly? Violent crime, careless promising, laziness, malicious dishonesty, impurities. These are the life of folly. That sounds very familiar to us. They teach, which is something that a lot of the Bible, frankly, doesn't try to do very much of. We talked a lot about how some parts of the Bible, like narrative, only teach implicitly. You have to read between the lines. But the proverb is intended to teach. It teaches care for the poor, respect for government leaders, importance of disciplining children, moderating the consumption of alcohol, regard for one's parents. But one problem with Proverbs, the question that people ask is, where is God? In the 31 chapters that make up the book of Proverbs, he is only mentioned 11 times. Chapter 2, 3, 14, 17, 25, 28, 30. I know because I just checked. Why? And how do we make sense of this? This is a problem for some people who need the Bible to be spiritual, always. And the tendency to always spiritualize everything may make us omit being able to see that the good God created the world good in the book of Genesis, and that the things that he created have a practical value in our life. That we can see God in places even where God's name is not specifically mentioned. And so that's a reminder of that. So, once again, how do we keep from mishandling or misusing Proverbs in particular? Well, Proverbs are figures of speech, like parables or contrived sayings. They express a particular expression of truth. And maybe the best way to think of them is they're designed to be catchy and memorable. Open up the fortune cookie and you can remember the little thing inside of there, right? This is the nature of what Proverbs are trying to do. They want you to remember them. You probably could quote quite a few of them. The problem is if I take one of those Proverbs and I extrapolate it to all circumstances, I will misuse it. Wisdom doesn't work like that. I'll just use an everyday example. Someone says to you, you should always look before you leap. never, 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 never jump before you leap. Somebody else comes to you and they say, he who hesitates is lost. Opportunity knocks. You better go. Which one is it? They're both supposedly great, wise sayings. But they're saying the opposite, aren't they? Of course, the answer is no, they're not. They must be applied appropriately. And this is true of the Proverbs. The way the authors describe it is they say Proverbs point toward truth. That's helpful to recognize, because somebody's just going to quote it, go, well, the Proverb says this. Yes, but you have to understand that it's wisdom, and wisdom moves you in the direction of it. And they use a lot of really good examples in the book that I'm not going to use because we don't have the time. So how do we make sense of this? Proverbs are not legal guarantees from God. They must be read as a collection, and they are worded to be memorable, not always, quote-unquote, theoretically accurate. In other words, you could take a proverb and go, well, it's not true in this situation. You said train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. But what about this child or that child? They're not promises. They're teaching us wisdom. They're teaching us what we should do in hopes that it will work out that way. Some proverbs need to be translated to be appreciated. I'd say they probably all need that to be translated well, to be understood. So those are some guidelines the authors give us. So that's Proverbs. Real quickly, just mention a couple other books. Something about Job, one of the great literary works. Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz, and Elihu. These friends come to him with this problem. Job has lost everything, and they conclude that he's done something wrong. It doesn't make sense to them that he could have gotten in the situation that he's in unless he did something wrong. That is because they assume, and you can't understand the book of Job without understanding this, they assume lex talionis, Latin for you get what you pay for. It's the law of karma. And they assume that if something bad has happened, it's because you've done something bad and God is punishing you. The law of lex talionis works like this. Is everything a direct result of God's will? It's posing that as a question. Job says, I did nothing to deserve this. His comforters, his friends, said, you did something. Job says, life's not fair. That's true, actually. Job says, why me? God says, my ways are above yours. Go ponder that. And then you leave the book of Job and you go on with life. So that's sort of the nature of it. The structure of the book of Job, of course, is the prologue is chapters 1 and 2. The epilogue, or the dialogue between him and his friends and everyone else is 3 through 42. And then the epilogue comes at the very end. So that's Job in 45 seconds. Ecclesiastes, everyone's favorite book in the church, that's a big joke, is a wisdom monologue. Job is a dialogue. Ecclesiastes is a monologue. It's a book being posed from the perspective of a single person. It puzzles us as Christians because it does not present everything from a Christian perspective. At least that's the way we interpreted that. There's two possible ways to handle Ecclesiastes. One is to see it as a cynical wisdom that is foiled. In other words, it's being put out there as like, this is what cynical wisdom looks like, and it's not accurate. The other is that it's a positive perspective on life under God. If you want to understand Ecclesiastes, you need to know a little bit about the structure of the book. There are 12 chapters. There is a prologue. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 11 is the prologue. It's about the teacher. His name is, in Hebrew, Kohelet. Kohelet is with a Q. Kohelet's the teacher. There's an epilogue at the end, chapter 12, 8 through 14. But the main body is the teacher, Kohelet, teaching. But the teacher's words are not the final word. And when you're reading Ecclesiastes, you got to know that. The key term to know throughout the book is, we call it meaningless, vanity, depending on your translation. Hebrew is hebel. It can mean meaningless, vanity, futility, vapor, breath. The question the authors say is, does it mean meaningless or does it mean ephemeral? Does it mean meaning cannot be found, or does it mean that there is no lasting aspect to that? And what if it doesn't mean one or the other? What if it's a combination of both? And what it's really asking is, can we find true meaning in anything that is temporary? That's a profound thought that's answered for us in the New Testament, I think, in a lot of different ways. Here are 5 realities from Ecclesiastes that we can just kind of remember. God's real. God's ways are not always understandable. What happens under the sun doesn't always add up. I mean, this can preach, y'all. Most things are repetitive. I mean, somebody said Groundhog Day, you know. Death is the great equalizer. Isn't that the truth of the literature? The last book, last second, I know I'm 30 seconds over, but is Song of Songs. I'll just say something about it. A lengthy love song, a ballad about human romance. It's written in the style of ancient Near Eastern lyrical poetry. Jews and Christians throughout history have tried to allegorize it, and they say it's about Christ's love for the church and all this kind of thing. Reality is that it's expressing human love. Chapter 4, verse 1 through 4 is clearly saying that, and that God has created sex as good, as a source of joy and blessing. But there's always the assumption of this idea of a monogamous marriage, which doesn't fit really well in our modern culture at all. But that's a little bit of the wisdom literature, and I got done. I got through it all tonight. And so I'm going to see everybody next week, and we're going to talk about the book of Revelation. So we are done.